Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is E.R. Gibbs, and tonight's presentation is Haiti, Triumph and Tragedy. I want to begin with a description of how Haiti came to the attention of the world. As you look at the information in front of you, including the map, bear in mind that Haiti occupies the western third of the island of Hispaniola. It's bounded on the north by the Atlantic Ocean, on the east by the Dominican Republic, on the south by the Caribbean Sea, and on the west by the Windward Passage, which separates it from Cuba. Now, bear in mind that there is a strategic importance to the Windward Passage. On the far end is the island of Cuba, but the Windward Passage is a slot connecting the Caribbean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Now let's go to the article at the bottom. This is from the National Intelligence newspaper with a date of 1845. It says, Haiti and Saint Domingo. In common with American journalists at large, we acknowledge our obligations to the Courrier des États-Unis for certain specific information respecting the Haitian Republic, attention to which will prevent a confounding of names that is all but too common. The name Hispaniola, Little Spain, was given by Columbus to the northern part of the island on which he landed. Subsequently, the French took possession on the western portion and called it Saint Domingo. In progress of time, both Spaniards and French were ousted by the colored race, who gave the name of Haiti to the whole island. But since the expulsion of President Boyer, there has been a separation of the eastern and western portions, the former of which is called the Dominican Republic and the latter the Haitian. The city of Saint Domingo is the capital of the Dominican Republic, and Port Republican, formerly Port-au-Prince, that of the Haitian. What all this means, brothers and sisters, is even while the indigenous people were occupying the island, when Columbus landed in 1492, he named the island La Isla Española, the Spanish island, in honor of his Spanish sponsors. The name later evolved into the present name Hispaniola. Now, after an early settlement near Cape Haitian was destroyed by Native Americans, the Spanish settled the eastern half of the island and left the west unsettled. Historians tell us that French pirates operating from the island of Tortuga hunted wild boar and other animals in Hispaniola to sell as food to passing ships. During their visits, the French recognized Hispaniola's potential as an agricultural center, and like the Spanish before them, they began importing enslaved Africans to serve as forced labor. By 1697, when Spain formally ceded the western third of Hispaniola, the portion that later became Haiti, to France, the French had established a flourishing slave plantation system throughout the colony. By the end of the next century, Saint-Domingue, the French colonial term for Haiti, was the world's, hear me now, richest colony. By 1791, the Pearl of the Antilles, as it was called, produced 60% of the world's coffee and 40% of its sugar. And so it is with that we go in a little bit further. Again, when we talk about the strategic location of Haiti, and you should see it about the center of the map entitled the Caribbean Zone. Notice that you'll see US possessions, English possessions, Central America, and British possessions. But if you look at Haiti, again, just about the center of the map right in front of you, if you trace your finger from the end of the eastern end of Cuba down through the projecting southern end of Haiti, you have just traced your way through what's known as the Windward Passage. Again, it is a slot that gives you a connection between the Atlantic Ocean, which is above you at the north, and the Caribbean Sea, which is below you. We oftentimes have to remind people that there were reasons that other nations sought and fought over Haiti. Whatever the condition may be in modern times, there were people who recognized first and foremost the location of Haiti. And then it wasn't long before this hellish system of agriculture based on a condition of permanent unfreedom, planting the cane, harvesting the crop, boiling the sugar, and then shipping it home, which in most cases meant Europe. We get a sense of how it became the world's, certainly France's, richest colony. The interest, as I say, from Europe goes back to Christopher Columbus in 1492. And as some of you may recall, in the year he sailed the ocean blue in 1492. This is the paperwork. This was Columbus's mission statement given to him by His Royal Majesties Ferdinand and Elizabeth, or Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, I want you to come down with me to the second large paragraph, because there's some key lines in here that I want you to be aware of. For as much of you, Christopher Columbus, are going by our command with some of our vessels and men to, here we go, discover and subdue some islands and continent in the ocean. And it is hoped that by God's assistance, some of the islands and continent in the ocean will be discovered and conquered. For those of you keeping count, this is the second time in a matter of 4 lines that words to this effect have appeared in the document known as the capitulations, or privileges and prerogatives granted by their Catholic majesties to Christopher Columbus. So we have discover and subdue. We have discovered and conquered by your means and conduct. Therefore, it is but just and reasonable that since you expose yourself to such danger to serve us, you should be rewarded for it. And we, being willing to honor and favor you for the mentioned reasons aforesaid, our will is that you, Christopher Columbus, after, here we go, after discovering and conquering the said islands and continent in the said ocean, or any of you shall be our admiral of the said islands and continent, you shall so discover and conquer that you be our admiral, viceroy, and governor in them. And we go down 6 more lines, and once again are instructed, Columbus and his men, to conquer, if not discover and subdue. So when we realize what is going on, when we understand that from the beginning, Columbus did not see what he was doing, neither did his sponsors, as a mission of peaceful encounter, that from the very beginning, it was discover and subdue. It was battle and conquer. It was victor and vanquished. Then we have a better sense of how this slaughter began. Here is a rather idealized image of Saint-Domingue in the 1770s. This is what France wanted the world to think was going on in Haiti. But oh, dear friends, we know that in terms of pure fiction, this ought to rank, you ought to give this an A++. For Haiti had become already by this time an island of death and suffering, an island that such savagery occurred that would make modern men blush. And here you get an example of it. The use of the lash was becoming increasingly popular, if you will, by the conqueror. The Pellerino was a place that was public whipping. You also have a similar place in Brazil. But before we go too more deeply into it, we owe a debt to Haiti. We'll come back to this right at the end of the presentation. And while you're looking at the image and reading the captions, I want you to bear in mind that the role which people of African descent have played from other lands in the American Revolution is comparatively unknown. That is to say, people of color. Now, the odds are that most of you have heard of von Steuben and Pulaski and Kosciuszko, and indeed even Lafayette. The odds are also great that you have not heard of the Fontages Legion from France, which served gallantly. There's a group of brothers from Haiti that served alongside the Continental Army. And at the Battle of Savannah on October 9th, 1779, more than 500 of these men, and this is a picture, a drawing of their uniform that you see on the right-hand side of your screen. They held back a fierce British attack that might well have wiped out French and American armies. Interestingly enough, one of the soldiers wounded in this hellish battle, considered by many military historians as one of the most savage of the American Revolution, was Sergeant Henri Christophe. Sergeant Henri Christophe, he returned to his country, later became second in command, serving alongside the man who was known as Haiti's George Washington. Of course, I'm referring to Toussaint Louverture. And after Louverture's death, Henri Christophe became the Emperor of Haiti. But we'll cross the bridge in a moment. Haitians have always writ large in the history of the United States. The horror is that it's not taught. But we would consider important Haitians such as Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, the founder of Chicago, with a cabin looking much like that depicted on this United States heritage stamp. Obviously, this is a very old heritage stamp. If a stamp was only 22 cents back then. But he settled in an area on the shore of Lake Michigan that the native peoples called Eschikagoo, which meant, well, for lack of a better description, stinking onions. But it would become the site of the city of big shoulders, Chicago. And Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, a native of Haiti, would be considered the first permanent settler of the mighty Chicago. Another Haitian American we don't often think of is William Edward Burghardt Dubois. He was of Haitian ancestry, this great intellectual scholar. And of course, we cannot tell the story of Haiti without looking at Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture. His last name means the opening. Francois Dominique Toussaint Louverture was both feared and admired throughout Europe and North America. Born enslaved, he was granted freedom and shortly after, in 1791, joined blacks in Haiti in a rebellion to liberate slaves. He was an organizational genius and soon became the leader of the revolt. He became increasingly powerful, and after the Spanish cession of Santo Domingo to France, he proclaimed himself governor of Haiti and Santo Domingo. In 1802, French forces sent in to take control were stunned at the ferocity of the resistance they met. Eventually, the French reestablished control and captured Toussaint Louverture by stealth and false promises, but he is shown above on the left-hand side, along with a scene from the revolt. There is a lot that we don't know about Toussaint Louverture, but let us say that in general terms, the Haitian Revolution, which he led but did not begin, it's important that we understand that it began in 1791 by enslaved blacks. It was a rebellion against slavery and French plantation owners, but became a political revolution that lasted for 13 years and resulted in independence from France. By 1804, the revolution had destroyed, the historians tell us, the dominant white population, the plantation system, and the institution of slavery in the most prosperous colony in the Western Hemisphere. And then the colony became the first independent Black republic in the world, the Republic of Haiti. So listen and think about the impact of this. Listen and think about the end, what would ultimately lead to the end of the transatlantic slave trade. The people of European descent were not solely responsible for ending the slave trade in the Americas. Revolts by enslaved Africans were common, especially in those areas where enslaved Africans outnumbered Europeans. You must keep that in mind. You're going to hear in other places that they were inspired by the Enlightenment, or perhaps even the Great Awakening. What you must understand is, first and foremost, although we believe that Toussaint Louverture was aware of some of the Enlightenment principles, they were observed only in amount by most racist Euro-Americans. But the motive force for Black people was their desire for freedom and independence, for justice and self-reliance. When the French tricked Toussaint Louverture and captured him, one of the things that they wanted to do was attempt to break his spirit. And so what you're looking at from my collection is a singular moment. Let's read it together. This is from an anti-slavery journal from April 1835. Take them back, since it must be so. I am determined to be faithful to my brethren and to my God. The friends of the enslaved are continually told that Africans are an inferior race. If this were true, it would be no good reason for enslaving them, but it is not. The world may safely be challenged to produce a nobler character than that of Toussaint Louverture, the George Washington of St. Domingo. Calumny has striven to paint him a monster. She has brought the printing presses of both continents to her aid, but in vain. To attempt to break his spirit, Napoleon sent envoys to his place of capture, and they brought his children and his wife, but it did not break him. He remained strong and unbowed, and he told the French emissaries, take them back, since it must be so. I am determined to be faithful to my brethren and to my God. All our lives, we've heard of give me liberty or give me death. We have not heard these lips of a Black man utter such words. But if our education system was where it should be, we would know about these majestic words. And we would know about a man whose hold on history was so extraordinary that 200 years after his death, nearly, people are still writing and studying about him. In 1794, 1795, he organized his infantry following that of the Republican Army in France. British troops, because they first expelled the British and then they would expel the French, suffered terrible losses due to deadly fevers, but also in battle. And these troops, Toussaint Louverture's Haitian infantry, 1798 to 1799, wore blue coats with red facings. Their pantaloons were white or blue. I share this information because we cannot be sure that some of the information I'm giving you tonight will be seen in many places in the United States. Read, if you will, Louverture in Captivity. People who are struggling in America today to have Black people respected and treated in a dignified way are still talking about Toussaint Louverture. He was a complex man. Yes, he rented a plot of land with 13 enslaved people attached to it, enjoyed prerogatives of a colonizer, but saw that was an empty life. And so from 1791, when he became politically active until his death, he never talked about that part of his life. He preferred to look beyond it. His status as a slave owner allowed him to gain the confidence of the French after the first slave revolts, even though he had actively participated in them. And this confidence would prove decisive in his drive to bring independence to Saint-Domingue. And so it was that he led his men. He was captured, as you see above, but that would not be the end of Toussaint Louverture, nor would it be an end to his legacy. His heroism and martyrdom have been memorialized by some of the Caribbean's most esteemed writers, including Martinican authors Edouard Glissant and Aimé Césaire. In fact, among the platitudes hurled in his direction by Césaire he describes Toussaint Louverture as a man who took a population and turned it into a people. One of the newer books about Louverture is down at the lower right-hand corner. It's entitled Black Spartacus, The Epic Life of Toussaint Louverture. This is one of the battles between during the Haitian Revolution between Louverture's men and Polish soldiers. And I want you to look to the left and see one of the Haitian soldiers holding up the decapitated head of one of the Polish soldiers brought to fight them. Time and time again, the world is stunned by the not only ferocity that these Black people show. It wasn't supposed to be this way. We were supposed to be little more than beasts, and cowardly beasts at that. But we soon found that that was not the case. And coming out of Haiti's government were philosophers and diplomats that astounded the world with their ability. And one of them was Belay, with the bust of the philosopher Raynal. This in a portrait by Girodet. Let's go on. I've mentioned savagery in the Haitian Revolution between the French soldiers and the Haitians. This is one example. This is a wicker statue made in the image of a Black man. You could open a door in the midsection of the wicker statue, and inside the wicker statue would be packed the entrails of animals. And you see the dogs on the right-hand side, the bloodhounds and the hunting dogs. And the French soldiers would move the wicker statue of the Black man close to the cage and then move it back away from the cage. Move it close to the cage and then again move it back from the cage, tantalizing the dogs, driving them into a frenzy so that then when they were let loose in a battle against the Haitians, they would go for the guts. They would tear out the midsections of the Haitian soldiers. And yet, the French and other European soldiers and diplomats constantly referred to the Haitians as savages. Then we have the burning of Cap Français, the general revolt of the Negroes, massacre of the whites. There was little time for reflection. The Haitians, having rebuffed England and on the cusp of rebuffing France, were fighting for their lives. They could not be sure what other European nation or constellation of European nations would be hurled against them than the very next time. And let us take a look at the American opinion of the Haitian Revolution. And this is an article from the Journal of the Diplomatic History from 2007. This successful Black uprising caused a crisis in the Washington administration because it threatened America's extensive commerce with Saint-Domingue, Franco and Anglo-American relations, and the racial stability of the South. Prior to the planted defeat in June 1793, the Washington administration received several appeals for help from the French whites of Saint-Domingue, and over a period of 22 months advanced the colonists $726,000. $726,000. Because above all, race mattered, money mattered. And despite all of the fulsome praise for independence, for liberty, it should have choked in the mouths of America's leaders, certainly in the mouth of George Washington, because he was not about, as a slave owner himself, he was not about to have anything to do with this. And we can go even deeper. These are in the papers of George Washington, the Library of Congress. Sir, I have received your letter of the 22nd instant, enclosing a copy of one from the French minister, and I have to inform you that your proceedings with respect to the minister of France meet my entire approbation. I am your able servant, G. Washington, Mount Vernon, 24 September 1791. Ternant had written Hamilton, that's Alexander Hamilton, of the alarming state of affairs in Haiti, the slave rebellion, asking for a loan not exceeding 40,000, with which to send urgently needed provisions to that island. Hamilton reported to the president that the U.S. funds were available to that amount and that he had placed that sum at the command of the French minister. But the French ultimately fell. Napoleon, a dejected Napoleon, decides to leave this portion of the hemisphere, not to return, and for pennies on the dollar, the United States increases by at least a third, and we have what we are taught in history. What really led to the Louisiana Purchase was the triumph of the Haitians over the very best the French had to bring against them. I'll just describe this. For a hot minute, and not any longer than that, Jefferson became enthused by the Haitian Revolution. And in looking at the reaction of his fellow slave owners, he came immediately to his senses and went against his talk of liberty and freedom and all that. Now, in American Negro slave revolts by Herbert Aptheker, we are reminded about the powerful effect that the uprising, the successful slave uprising in Haiti had on revolts by enslaved Black folk in the United States. And this masterwork that deserves to be better known, by the way, again, the book is the American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert Aptheker, and it is a compendium of slave revolts and attempted slave revolts. And here we have one, the whites were paranoid that the same thing was going to happen to them, that they would be killed or driven off the island. This is a description of a white man who had overheard, quote, one who seemed to be the chief speaker said, "You see how the blacks has killed the whites in the French island and took it a while ago?" This deposition and a copy of a letter found in Yorktown, signed Secret Keeper Richmond, aroused the fears of 5 aldermen of Petersburg, so that on August 17th, they asked the governor for arms. A similar appeal came from Portsmouth, Virginia. The eminent John Marshall himself sent a letter he had received from Powhatan in Virginia to the governor, describing the absconding of Negro drivers, the whipping of numerous slaves, and affirming, taking all matters into consideration, I can't help thinking that the intended rising is true. Their worst nightmare was becoming a reality. Freedom-seeking Blacks, not on an island in the Caribbean, but yards from where these white folks ate and slept. This is the beginning of the Declaration of Independence for Haiti, found just a few years ago, but must be ranked with some of the great articles of government and evidence of independence. For this document sent out, liberty or death, we have to understand it is entirely different when Black people say it. It gives it a new and far more cogent meaning. Toussaint Louverture will pass on. He will be, as I say, tricked by the French. And after his death, relations will deteriorate that much further. And he himself will die. But those who had served under him continued to fight for freedom and independence. And so it brings us now to a man whose name still sends shivers through, how shall we put it, Frenchophile folk around the world, and that is Henri Christophe. He had been a lieutenant of Toussaint Louverture. He had learned battle from the ground up. I already told you that as a young sergeant, he had fought in the Battle of Savannah. And so it was that military action was nothing new to him. But slavery, consistent mistreatment had brutalized him and made people fear him. And he had his own ideas about how Haiti should be run, about the future of the country, and what should go next in terms of Haiti and its relations with the rest of the world. Dessalines is violent, but he had become from a violent system. This is one example. This is one example. It is he supposedly said that every last white dog must die. And in his mind, his paranoia, his violence, his brutality also led him to begin to oppress other Black folk. And his officers would soon rise against him. But he militarized even further the Army of the Republic of Haiti. Here's a picture of their uniforms about the year 1808. The infantry have blue coats and cuffs with red collars. The grenadiers have blue with red epaulets. The artillery have blue coats, collars, and lapels, and cuffs trimmed with red. There are those who would have you believe that the only time Haitians made an appearance on the battlefield, they were dressed in rags or near rags. As you can see, I presented you evidence this evening that that was not the case. Comes now the marvelous Henri Christophe. The Henri Christophe. Misunderstood and misrepresented. No, he did not have formal education, but 7 years after helping to win Haiti's independence in 1811, Henri Christophe built an empire in the northern section of the country. Despite some progressive social and educational policies, Christophe's rule was brief, ending with his suicide in 1820. But he left his mark in that the remains of his palace still stand. And I found this for sale in a book of memorabilia. It is an ordinary everyday order issued by Henri Christophe. That is his signature down at the bottom. And this is about supplies. Again, it's nothing special, but it is what a general, a head of state would do on a daily basis. We come now to Alexander Pichon, who served as president of the Haitian Republic. By this time, and because of previous rulers, Haiti is split. It is called the Divided Republic. Alexander Pichon, a mulatto leader of the Haitian Revolution and president of the Republic of Haiti, was educated in some of the best military schools of France, and he had served in the French army in Europe. In what began as a three-sided struggle for control of the French island of Haiti, the French general Leclerc thought that because of intrigue and bribery, he could keep the three parts separate, pit the mulattoes against the Blacks with the intent of crushing a revolt for independence. Of course, in 1803, Dessalines, whom we just saw, the strongest of the insurrection's generals, defeated the French at Cap Francais and was elected governor of Haiti for life. He placed his foremost prominent leaders in command of the 4 departments of the island. Pichon, Christophe, the Black general, and Pichon, the mulatto, were entrusted with 2 of the divisions on the island. The despotic rule of Dessalines resulted in his assassination in 1806, and this led to rivalry between Christophe and Pichon for control of the island. Stay with me, stay with me. Pichon, as a natural leader of the mulattoes, dreamed of an ideal republic controlled by his people. But how realistic was that when the mulattoes were far outnumbered by Black Haitians? And through the support of the mulattoes, he was made chairman of the committee to draft the Constitution and was elected president. Christophe immediately waged war on the republic, but it ended in a stalemate. But then Pichon is declared president of the South and West, forming the Republic of Haiti. The government of the republic was more liberal and democratic than the monarchical state under Christophe in the North. Pichon carried out land redistributions as rewards to veterans of the revolution and put into practice his ideas of self-sustaining agriculture. For they already realized if Haiti was going to survive, it had to be self-sustaining. But he did some other things, which we hope will increase our respect for Haiti. By the way, while we're doing that, I want to show you President Boyer. Both Pichon and Boyer, man you see here, had the temerity to, in the early 1800s, let Black folk in America know that Haiti was the one place outside Africa that they could come to help remake Haiti, and in that process, remake the Black world. Slave owners in the United States, particularly in the Deep South, were aghast that these stiff-necked Negroes had the gall to reach out to their colored folk. They would have to adjust. They would have to adjust. And Pichon becomes another Haitian of world renown because of what you're looking at. From the book Revolutionary Freedoms by Cecile Asseline, Jessica Adams, and Elmide Melance, and Jean-Pierre Ulrich, in his letter, Simon Bolivar. Now understand that there was no place he initially rebuffed and defeated El Libertador of South America, much of South America. Simon Bolivar could go but to Haiti. It was the one place in the hemisphere that shared his ideas about the support of revolutionary government. So this is what the book says. In his letter, Bolivar praised Pichon for his magnanimity and tolerance and wished to express his gratitude to him personally. He insisted on his commitment to the abolition of slavery in the territory, for Pichon to just not give him arms and money with no strings attached. There was one large string, that Bolivar must free the enslaved Black people in the nations of South America that he liberated. In gratitude, Bolivar expressed his desire to publicly acknowledge the Haitian president as the liberator of Venezuela and much of South America, then known as New Grenada. Pichon's response followed the next day. He wished Bolivar complete success in his struggle for liberty and the end of slavery in South America, but demanded that his name not be mentioned. Nevertheless, the remarkable role played by Pichon in Bolivar's triumph remains to this day a famous episode in the history of the Caribbean, and I might add, South America, as well as compelling evidence of the impact of the Haitian Revolution on the Americans. And then from another source, Haitian slaves set the course for the liberation of all Latin America. Indeed, the liberator himself, Simon Bolivar, twice received arms and sustenance from a third free leader, Alexander Pichon, after Bolivar had been banished from Venezuela. In 1815, Pichon provided Bolivar with gunpowder guns and that most essential evidence of a revolution, a printing press, to spread words and encourage acts of deliverance. In 1816, Pichon equipped Bolivar once again. In return for his support, Pichon asked Bolivar to free the slaves wherever he routed the Spanish. Bolivar did not always keep his faith with the Haitian leader, and he and some of his generals would soon disremember the essential help that he had gotten from the Haitians. I told you that Pichon and Boyer had offered Haiti as a place for Black Americans tired of slavery and racism to come. Here is such an invitation so that you see it yourself. From the Niles Weekly Register newspaper, Haiti, President Boyer, and this is from 1820, is inviting the free Blacks of the United States to immigrate to Haiti in preference to Africa, promising them protection and assistance. An address to the Haitians on this subject says, our past sufferings are unexampled efforts to regain our primitive rights, to our solemn oath to live free and independent, the happy situation of our island, which may be justly called the Queen of the Antilles, the astonishing fertility of its soil, which makes it the guard of the Western archipelago, the progress of its inhabitants in civilization and some of the fine arts, our wise constitution, which ensures a free country to Africans and their descendants, all lead us to believe that the hand of providence has destined Haiti for a land of promise, a sacred asylum where our unfortunate brethren will, in the end, see their wounds healed by the balm of equality and their tears wiped away by the protecting hand of liberty. Americans were aghast at this language, that Black folks were stretching out arms to each other, encircling the Western Hemisphere, and it shook them to their very marrow. And it's not going to be too long before the United States moves in to colonization business full force with the Monroe Doctrine, where it tells the nations of Europe, we got this. Y'all go wherever else you want to, but we will assume the role of the chief aggrandizer and colonizer in this hemisphere. Women have always assumed a large position in Haitian history, not only for their beauty as we see here, but as generals, as diplomats, as inspirations. But to the Haitians, they kept sending messages to Black folk in the United States. As the Civil War looms in the United States, the Haitians name a boulevard after, of all people, the martyr John Brown. Again, white America is fit to be tied at the temerity of the Haitians. They cannot believe it. In 1862, finally, the United States gives diplomatic recognition to the nation of Haiti. And this is it is in this article, in this newspaper rather, that you would see it. It may not be not mentioned here, but this is the New York Times, April 4th, 1862. And elsewhere in the paper, it acknowledges the U.S. is partnering with Haiti. In fact, Lincoln does this in part because he has plans. He wishes to relocate free Blacks from the District of Columbia to Haiti, at least to an island off the coast of Haiti, in a move for colonization, but that fails. That doesn't happen. The influence of the revolution of Haiti continues to enliven and speak to the hearts of freedom-seeking Black folk. This Frederick Douglass many times refers to Haiti and Toussaint L'Ouverture in terms of the struggle for Black independence. And we see him here at an abolitionist meeting in 1843. Years later, we're going to get attempts by the United States to strike deals with the use of Haitian territory as a coaling station for naval vessels and private commercial vessels. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass is sent to as a minister to Haiti is to negotiate the acquisition of the Mole St. Nicholas in the island of Haiti. He may be one of the first, but he would not be the only one. And even as though Haiti and other islands in the Caribbean are dealing with a new era of American colonization and extension, please understand that beginning on a warm day in 1877, the new United States minister to the Republic of Haiti arrived at the presidential palace in Port-au-Prince to present his credentials. For the next 8 years, John Mercer Langston, a former slave who became head of Howard University's law school, worked to build better relations between the United States and Haiti. His careful studies of the island's economy enabled American exporters to penetrate the British and French monopoly on Haitian commerce. And in a short time, American fabrics were appearing in Haitian shops, and Americans were drinking Haitian coffee. John Mercer Langston, along with Frederick Douglass, and even historian George Washington Williams. George Washington Williams, I need to make this quick distinction, is nominated as a diplomat to Haiti, but because of political intrigue, he is not allowed to take his seat. But it does not stop his interest. The great historian George Washington Williams, the author of one of the first lengthy works on African-American history, the history of the Negro race in America, 1619 to 1880. And it is also at this time that we need to reflect on how Haiti got back in the good graces of the rest of the world. Angry that the Haitians had stopped British designs on the island, had nullified French designs on the island, they made it clear that Haiti was going to have to pay a price. Haiti was going to have to pay a price to rejoin the family of nations, or it would remain an outcast. France initially demanded reparations. Hear me, brothers and sisters. France demanded that Haiti, for fighting for its own freedom, should be paid reparations. When you hear white America talk about reparations, please remind them that a Black nation had to pay them to France first. Now, over the next century or so, France initially demanded a payment of $150 million. That was reduced to 90 million. And over the next century or so, Haiti paid French slaveholders and their descendants the equivalent of between 20 and 30 billion dollars in today's dollars. Between 20 and 30 billion. They did not stop paying it until 1947. How can a struggling nation, newly birthed, take on that kind of debt? It puts Haiti at a detriment in terms of finance, in terms of internal development, in terms of taking care of the people of Haiti that it is in part still suffering from. If for no other reason than in order to help pay the reparations to France, they cut down thousands of trees, denuding their hillsides and allowing erosion to come in and do environmental damage that the island is suffering from even today. And so by the early years of the 20th century, as America reasserts its colonist impulses, we see that they have designs on Haiti, as well as other nations in the Caribbean. There are a new generation of Haitians, many of them generals, some self-styled. Most of them are brushed out of the way of the United States. But there is still great animosity toward any kind of Black self-independence. This is an article that I've highlighted on the right-hand side that talks about Havana merchant believes Cuba is destined to be another Haiti, because Cuba, which again is just across the Windward Passage, west of Haiti, has a large Black population. You might not know that if all you did was to get your early education about Cuba from Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. But we're talking about what is essentially an African nation. And anytime, Black people in this hemisphere and around the world have sought to fight for their own independence, they have been ruthlessly, if you will, guillotined in the press and misrepresented elsewhere. In fact, a few years after this, in about 1911, 1912, the PIC, which is the Independent Party of Color in Cuba, will be massacred. The Bank of Haiti, United States, claiming mismanagement, will cast its covetous eyes on the wealth of Haiti and take the bank over and start slowly looting it. And under the rubric of not only in Haiti, not only represented in Cuba, but Black people are planning yet another republic. If you want to believe this article from 1903, there has been a national organization formed to conquer Haiti and set up a unique government under Booker T. Washington. Now, anybody that's done any reading on Washington knows that this is a ridiculous article. Washington was not going to set up any Black republic outside the United States, although they claimed that the Black folk were going to establish an army to seize Haiti and make it an American republic, and then run it to the fear of white people in the United States and Europe. Haiti would become part of the American empire, an empire that James Buckley, the white American conservative, never admitted that the United States had, and yet it did. I'll never forget watching the original Firing Line and have him tell a reporter, United States never had an empire. I don't know what he was smoking. This empire, which included Haiti, was really a collection of nations of people of color. In fact, one caption for the image that you see in front of you at the top was America's Negro Empire. And what were its constituents? Its constituents were the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii, among many others. And Uncle Sam is saying to the class, now, children, you've got to learn these lessons, whether you want to or not, but just take a look at the class ahead of you. Remember that in a little while, you will be as glad to be here as they are. And in the back of the classroom, students representing California, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and Alaska, well, they are calmly reading. Now, in the front row are boys representing the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii, looking bored and out of place. So this is a distillation of the civilizing impulse of white folk on these nations of people of color, supposedly. Here is from a similar cartoon. The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without the consent until they can govern themselves. And here you have the linchpin of American gunboat diplomacy and democracy in the early 20th century. Here is a op-ed cartoon, an editorial cartoon, mocking the establishment of America's Negro Empire. And here we have Uncle Sam holding his end up and showing the Puerto Rico and the Philippines, and well, you get the idea. But if you didn't, here's another example from the Rocky Mountain News, Denver, 1900. By gum, or if you prefer, by golly, I rather like your looks, as United States establishes its own empire at roughly the same time that the scramble for Africa is going on, that the collapse of China is concluding. We've talked about America's Negro Empire. Part of that was the Philippines. And of course, under the leadership of this man, Emilio Aguinaldo. But there were people who planned that the Philippines, with their flag, the sun and stars, would come under the control of the Stars and Stripes. If you take a look at this opinion cartoon, op-ed cartoon, Emilio Aguinaldo, the man I just showed you, is shown on the right hand hugging the palm tree. But afterwards, he led his native Filipinos in a 2-year war against Yankee imperialism. And this is already after the Filipino people fighting against the Spanish for many years. He thought, listening to the United States talk about freedom and justice and independence, that they would be natural allies of the Philippine people. That would turn out to be a colossal misjudgment. In 1901, he was captured. The 1899 cartoon shows 3 countries already in the United States tent, but not yet Emilio Aguinaldo. As America extended its arms beyond the Caribbean and into parts of Asia, this is a cartoon that should have made wise people think. And it was a question that some Buffalo soldiers were asked while they were fighting in the Philippines for American control of those islands. How can you be over here when your people are being lynched at home? When you see what's going on your own land, why are you here? And we do know that at least a handful of Buffalo soldiers would take the side of the Filipino people. But we return back to the Caribbean for another example of U.S. perfidy. In the early 1900s, a smoking volcano was pictured on a Nicaraguan postage stamp. By chance, that volcano erupted while Congress was debating the site for a proposed canal through Central America. To persuade Congress to turn down the Nicaraguan route, the leading stockholder in the French company that controlled the Panama route sent a copy of the stamp to every congressman. Soon after, Congress chose the Panamanian route over the one that went through Nicaragua. So despite American intrigue in Nicaragua, things turned against them. And America was moving into the other side of Hispaniola, into the Dominican Republic, and replacing America, replacing the traditional leadership, the Spanish-speaking leadership, with American soldiers and their new Springfield rifles. That's what it means by guaranteeing a national debt with ball cartridges. In the meantime, one of the world's greatest engineering projects, the Panama Canal, is being built as a slash across the midsection of North America and South America. And the majority of the workers are Black men from the islands of the Caribbean. They will dig the trenches, the escarpments, and lose thousands of lives in the process. It took 10 years and cost $375 million, and countless lives of Black men from Jamaica and all of the countries and islands of the Caribbean. In fact, here we have one of the rare articles on some of the problems in the Big Ditch. 5,000 idle Negroes on the Isthmus of Panama. The West Indian labor found increasingly uncertain. The Negroes disposed to seek other work. Many of them are now driving cabs in Panama. One big reason was the Jim Crow nature of the American Panama Canal Company. They did not pay all of its workers equally. The white American workers, the European workers were paid in gold for one thing, but the brothers were paid in silver. So the people of Haiti are looked at as we move toward the First World War as subjects of criticism. They're dealing with constant complaints that their government is unstable. And then we see in the push to justify the coming invasion that you must have law and order in Haiti, that you must have something to bring this savagery to be checked. And so articles like this flooded white American newspapers. Voodooism in the West Indies. Negroes in Haiti and Cuba condemned to death for sacrificing infants in their horrid devil worship savage scenes in wild mountain fastness. And so the white world was brought around to justifying the coming American invasion of Haiti. Now, by the way, this was always pulled out anytime they wanted to supposedly besmirch African religions and traditions. And this is an article from a DC newspaper about the use of what the author called voodoo in 1889 in Washington, DC. And it was possible until the early 2000s to go to High John the Conqueror route. Some of you may know about voodoo or hoodoo, and that was big. These were leftovers from our traditional religion. So by 1920, we're coming upon a new power relationship in the Caribbean as we look at these other countries. And we'll note that countries that a growing number are now colonies of the US. And of course, if you take a look at Cuba, Spanish-American War has been concluded. There's a US base in Cuba, still there today. You may recall that it starts with the first letter G, the Guantanamo. But protesting that the appointment by the American government of a high commissioner in Haiti, as suggested by the Special Senate Committee, which is investigating conditions in that country, would amount to placing Haiti under a protectorate. Dr. Pierre Houdecourt of Port-au-Prince told the committee at hearings that the Haitians would not recognize the right of the United States to interfere with their independence. But these are the pretexts, I told you they were coming, for what this one Black newspaper would call the crushing of Haiti. The sad story of the world's most beautiful island, told by James Weldon Johnson, the civil rights figure, NAACP leader, and co-author of the song Lift Every Voice and Sing the Black National Anthem, who investigated conditions there and made such a report that the civilized world was shocked thereby. Under Toussaint Louverture, the great Black warrior and statesman, the rival of Napoleon in military genius, the Negroes shook off the shackles of slavery and attained a degree of statecraft 100 years ahead of the times. Alas, the deterioration of late years was increased immeasurably during the regime of Wilson and the occupancy of the island by American Marines. And so the Marines have invaded Haiti on flimsy pretexts in situations that the Haitians would never willingly submit to. And before you know it, American media are talking about under US control, graft in the US and US misrule in Haiti. To the extent that during the First World War, the Haitians favored Germany. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. A great pro-German demonstration occurred in Cap Haitian Saturday in celebration of the signing of the disarmament agreement. Anything the Haitians could do to demonstrate their dislike of American rule, of American racism, they would do. German plot to start World War at Haiti failed by hair's breadth. Scheme to precipitate conflict through attack on US, frustrated by Austrian-Serbian declaration, intrigues revealed involving Mexico throw a light on Wilson's attitude on other international issues. President Woodrow Wilson was an arch racist. Quotations from one of his racist history books were shot through the images of the flickering images of the silent film Birth of a Nation. There would be people who would speak out against the American colonization of islands in the Caribbean. One of them would be a well-known general, General Smedley D. Butler. In fact, there was a military base on the island of Okinawa named after General Butler. He and other whites who served and saw the misrule and the violence of white Americans against the Haitian people wrote about this in two books that deserve to be much better known: Black Baghdad and War is a Racket. And then Congress looked into the occupation and administration of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You now have a sense of what they're going to find. They do not find good administration. They find what we can only call an attitude of contemptuousness by the Americans toward the Haitians, primarily because of the color of their skin. And we begin to see nauseating practices being levied against the people in colonies controlled by the United States. One of the earliest examples is waterboarding. Waterboarding, known a century ago as water torture or the water cure, was also used by white American soldiers during the American occupation of Haiti. And Governor William Howard Taft reluctantly called it torture during a Senate hearing in 1902. So understand how far back this evil, pernicious practice goes and who some of its earliest victims were. Custom House, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. There is virtually no more love for the brown people of the Dominican Republic than there is for the Black people of Haiti. The Haitians continue to resist. They continue to publish newspapers even during the American occupation. And interestingly enough, this is an extraordinary article by one of America's highest ranking Black military officers to be prepared for an invasion. The War Department has determined to maintain order in Haiti, and plans have been completed looking to an invasion of the island with armed troops. The arrangements have been made in harmony with secret reports sent in by Captain Charles Young, who had served with the Buffalo Soldiers and been an American military training officer in Liberia. And he's seeking to let the world know what the United States plans are. In other media, American media, Haiti peeved with our leathernecks because of disgraceful treatment done to Haitians by American Marines. The Marines landed in Haiti in July 1915 because Americans were in danger. They found it necessary to help considerably in keeping order. They found the country overrun with Cacos, people, revolutionaries, but they were called bandits by the Americans. And so the Marines set about exterminating the Cacos. But Haiti is not an easy country for a white man to travel, and its band proved to be real fighters. But finally, the remaining bandits made their last stand in an old French fort on the crest of a mountain. And this article goes on to talk about the battles. Even French forces landed in Haiti to assist the Americans. And we know about the enmity between Haiti and France already. The consternation and the resistance grow and grow and grow, as do the misrepresentations of the Haitians fighting back against the Americans. Now it's savagery in Haiti, vividly portrayed by American engineers. War reigns again in the Black Republic. Governor of Port-au-Prince and 160 others killed. the president of Haiti takes refuge because he is seen as a figurehead by the Haitian people. And this is a scene of one of the occupations in Haiti at that time. These are some of the lighter skinned, wealthier people, the Creole class. President Sudre d'Artiguenave, again, a tool of the US interest. This is a member of the Cocos, the revolutionaries that fight against the Americans. And understand that Jamaica, along with Jamaica and one of the cultural wells of the Caribbean is Haiti. It's music, it's literature, it's art from people like Jacques Romain have influenced literature, culture, and art around the world. We've talked about Johnson and his reports on Haiti, but they still claim that they were still needed as years later. And see how the Haitians are depicted. And so we have a white Marine telling a quote unquote Haitian, we will probably stay a little while longer. And they do. But it is hard to adjust to the conditions of life in Haiti, an agricultural and agrarian society. They don't have enough roads. But what they do have increasingly are Haitian revolutionaries fighting against the American military occupation. Here are a few of the country's bad men in a picture taken at Port-au-Prince. They forget that the Haitians are proud people, that they're never going to completely submit to being occupied by the French or the Americans. They prize their independence. They are buoyed and buttressed by their history of resistance. And one of the leaders of the revolutionaries, of the people demeaned as simply bandits, is the man in the center of the picture with the snazzy hat and tie. His name is Charlemagne Perrault. They soon understand that they've got to kill him. He represents the heart of the resistance. He must be exterminated. And in one of the most famous battles of the Marine occupation of Haiti, the capture of Fort Riviere in Haiti, this leads to the assassination of Charlemagne Perrault. And since no white man can get so close to him, they use a black emissary to help this Marine kill the leader of the Haitian resistance. And then these Marines that slew the Haitian bandit are honored in the US. Disguised as natives, they penetrate lair in the hills and fought their way back to his camp. And this is the final remains of Charlemagne Perrault. But they didn't understand that putting him, splaying him on a church door would send a different message to the Haitians. To the Haitians, this indomitable fighter for liberty was like Christ. And they compared the way he was laid, perhaps even thrown on this door, his dead body, to Christ himself after the crucifixion. It simply renews their desire to fight. And so when we look at the beginnings of the First World War, the reign of Mars is also in Haiti. From this time period, the US leaves an indelible stamp on Haiti. Ultimately, there will be the Duvaliers, father and son. By the time of the Carter administration, and there are thousands of Haitian immigrants coming to South Florida. In fact, there are pictures of the bodies of dead Haitians washing up on the beach. And how is it that even Jimmy Carter, the great humanitarian, has a discriminatory policy toward Haitian refugees when in 1980, make a careful examination of this. He's telling the Haitians, no, telling the Cubans, come ahead. And then we have Jean Bertrand Aristide. We have a new regime, but America has got its fist in the pot of soup, and it doesn't look like it's inclined to take it out anytime soon. And so there is great dissension on the island of Haiti. And ultimately, a priest, will be forced to step down. Aristide's call for reparations. He remains unbroken and unbowed, even though he, for a time, finds himself on the outs with the United States, but he bravely calls for reparations for Haiti. And then we have a series of earthquakes in the early 2000s that send shockwaves through the island of Haiti. And understand, Haiti has substantial deposits of minerals and metals. But from this time, Bertrand Aristide was elected president in 1990, but the military arrested and expelled him from the country in the following year. The Coast Guard intercepted some 35,000 Haitian refugees as they tried to enter the United States between 1991 and 1992. Most were returned to Haiti. And there was a new upsurge of refugees in late 1993. Once again, past is prologue. The past is prologue. The UN authorized in 1994 an invasion of Haiti led by the US multinational force. A full-scale invasion was averted, but on September 18th, when military leaders agreed to step down, Aristide was restored to office on the 15th of October. Aristide will be moved aside. Andre Preval will be elected or selected, and we will have cholera epidemics. We will have more earthquakes, and Michel Martelly, an entertainer, will win in 2011, but there will be a spasm of instability. And then in 2016, Michel Martelly will occupy the president's seat for a time. There will be protests. Juvenal Moise will be once again shown to be a steward of the US. And then COVID will strike Haiti. In the midst of all of the instability, a series of earthquakes and bad weather, we see the presidential palace, how it looked in its last few days when it was complete and unharmed, and the symbolic meaning of the items at the foot of the statue, the black maroon, the US reinvasion, the massive quake in 2010. Obama will come down and meet with Rene Preval of Haiti. None of that seems to last. It is necessary, perhaps now more than ever, to rebuild Haiti, and this, by the way, is a breakout of some of the mineral deposits in Haiti. Other people are studying this, gold and silver and copper. And they want you to believe that Haiti has nothing. Haiti reconstruction will be the subject of massive corruption. Today, we know that the Haitians are the central part of Haiti. Yes, they are gangs, but there are also 6 families of light-skinned Haitians that control most of what happens on the island. If you needed a reference point, one of the leading families is called the Mevs, M-E-V-S, M-E-V-S. They control everything that goes, even the gangs. They've learned to work with the gangs to exploit the Haitian people. And where there are visions of possibilities, corruption and mismanagement tend to hamper them. Even the Red Cross in 2015 is shown to fail the Haitian people. And then this cartoon is talking about how, for a moment, the American public is hypnotized by the suffering in Haiti, and then it quickly forgets it. Once again, the United States of amnesia. Dominican Republic, the problems of race and color with their neighbor, the Dominican Republic, and the continuing attempts by the Dominican Republic to expel anyone that quote unquote looks Haitian continues to roil the relations between the others. And then comes the new earthquake, kills 225, but now we know that there were thousands more of that. There are battles between the police and the gangs and an assassination of a president, while Haitians continue to leave the island in droves, coming into South America, coming into Chile. Police officers clean a street in Port-au-Prince that has been blocked by protesters and by friends of Biana Belizaire, who was kidnapped for 5 days last month. We know that a group of Americans have been kidnapped. It would appear that kidnapping is now has reached an art form in Haiti, and another example of the collapse of anything resembling a government. Oh, there's still money to be made. There's still people who are going to make it, but it will not be the poor Haitians. It will not be the people at the bottom who suffer the most. And I suppose it never has. So when we examine, when we look at the moments of tragedy and triumph, I believe that the trek of Haitians through the spine of Central America will one day be known as one of the great moves toward freedom in the world. Haitians, having left Haiti, certainly cannot come directly to the United States, but that doesn't try them. So some of them have gone to nations in South America, and then they make a great overland trek through the Isthmus of Panama and into a place known as the Darien Gap, where there are jungle-covered mountains, swamps, poisonous snakes, and not only Haitians, but people seeking economic advancement and opportunity from Venezuela, Cuba, even India, and several African countries. It's a roadless 60-mile wide stretch. They climb, they crawl. This year so far, 100,000 migrants have come through the Darien Gap. If you look at the map at the bottom in the center, it will show you where the Darien Gap is. The depredations of drug gangs, foul river water, rape, robbery, and it takes a week to cross to get to the Panamanian side. And these migrants, particularly the ones from Haiti, are lucky to have a backpack and cooking pots and jugs of drinkable water. And this is what's going on. People who had already endured this found themselves under the Del Rio Bridge in Texas, on the Texas-Mexico border. Now they're attempting to discuss a remain in Mexico problem, a remain in Mexico policy. We don't give that a whole lot of hope. Perhaps the only thing that we can give hope to is the resilience and the strength, the courage and resolve of the Haitian people. For that is the one unflagging quality that has changed. With their culture, with their music, with their religious beliefs, they have continued to influence the nations of the world and offered a musical legacy that continues to astound us today. We can only hope that justice and mercy will continue, that in fact it will rain down like water. We know that during the assassination of their most recent president, that there were mercenaries from the United States involved. We also know as well that the country is effectively controlled by what's called a core group of outside nations, including the United States. But we believe that these will be temporary phases of Haiti's history. Finally, we owe a debt to Haiti ourselves. After all, this was the country that fought for American independence. Understand that. They fought for American independence, and the defeat of the French by the Haitians, the withdrawal, caused the withdrawal of Napoleon. Have you thought about how we might very well be speaking French now if the French had stayed in this hemisphere? They were a powerful counterpoint to the American Navy. So here we have a country who has been a point of inspiration for other freedom movements throughout the Caribbean, South America, and the world. Here we have a Black nation that sent men to fight in the American Revolution. Here we have people from a nation whose resolve continues to astound people today. These are the heart of our debt to Haiti, not to mention the fact that they should be paid for having been forced to give that money to France. But this is the complex skein of events that bind Haiti and the United States. And we will continue to have a shared history for, if there is such a thing as the foreseeable future. Good evening.